and welcome to our event this evening, Stimulus Checks. We're going to be looking at the economic impact payments in the US and what they mean for basic income in the US, but also particularly in the UK, how this will help us make the case for a basic income or not, depending on how our wonderful panel takes it. Let's see where the arguments go tonight. I'm Cleo Goodman. I'm the co-founder of the Basic Income Conversation. So the Basic Income Conversation is hosting this evening's event. It'll be myself and Michael Pugh who are the hosts. We also have the panel, Almaz, Natalie and Martin joining us this evening, and Michael will introduce them in just a minute. Thanks once again for joining us. If you're here on YouTube in the future, welcome to you too. Tonight is the first event in our new series of Research Network seminars hosted by the Basic Income Conversation. So we as an organisation are set up to stimulate the conversation about basic income in the UK, to increase the standard of it, which is why we have this particular focus on research and technical understanding of basic income, but also to make that more accessible to a wider audience and to stimulate conversation between normal people. Some of you have been to our events before, so thank you so much for coming back. If this is your first one, welcome, grateful to have you here. Our organisation is hosted by the think tank Compass. They do lots of fantastic work around progressive politics in the UK, and our approach to basic income and to the work that we do is to do it in different spheres. So in the research space, in the political space, the activists who are doing a significant amount of work pushing basic income in the UK at the moment, really successful. The news from Wales that they're planning to pilot a basic income is in no small part due to the hard work of activists in Wales. And we also focus on engaging civil society, so the intersecting issues with basic income, exploring the potential of that. But the research network that we host was set up to generate greater collaboration between people working on research to do with basic income and adjacent issues, whether social issues or other economic kind of issues. The purpose of that is to generate opportunities in that kind of space of research, greater collaboration, and to avoid duplication of work, so we can get more nerdy about basic income more quickly and make a better case for it there. If you're interested in joining the research network, I'll pop a link in the chat so you can take a look at that and get in touch and see if you fancy joining it. And the other side of our work is kind of our own research. As you can probably tell by the name, the Basic Income Conversation, we're interested in stimulating conversations. And part of how we're doing that is through the toolkit that we've designed. So asking people to host conversations with people that they know about basic income and to understand a little bit about how they think it would impact their lives, how their lives would change with a basic income. And we have built that so we have a bit of a feedback loop there and can gather those stories and that information. So I'll pop the link to the toolkit in the chat too. Shortly, I'll hand over to Michael. You won't hear much more from me until the end here. But just before I hand over, another wee bit of housekeeping. Do try and keep yourselves on mute as much as possible. And we will use the chat box to talk to you guys today. We'll leave the speaker function for our speakers, for our panel, and for Michael. So if you have anything you wanted to add, if you have questions, pop that all in the chat box. Really, really glad to hear that in there. And to start off, if you want to put your name and where you're calling in from today, it would be really interesting to see where everyone is. We'll do a Q&A later, so we'll hear an initial talk, an introduction from each of our speakers, and about 6:40 we'll enter into the Q&A. So I'll be picking out questions and feeding them to Michael so he can ask them. Pop them in the chat, and if you want to send them to me directly, that will make sure that I see them. We won't be able to ask all of the questions, we never can, so I'll be picking the ones that sort of flow with the conversation best. So please, don't take it personally if your question doesn't get answered, and you can follow up by email if you're particularly keen to understand that. That is pretty much all I have to say, I think, Mike, unless I've missed anything, but you can pick that up. But thanks once again for being here. I'm excited to hear from our speakers.
Thank you so much, Cleo. It's great introduction, and it's great to see some of the names coming in there. We've got Diana from Vienna, David from Southall, Tim from Kent, Michael from Manhattan, all around the world. Please do keep introducing yourselves on the chat. That would be fabulous. Who I am, I'm the director and co-founder of the Basic Income Conversation alongside Cleo. What are we going to be talking about tonight then? We're going to be looking at what is happening in the United States and analysing what it means for the growing basic income movement, both there, but also what it means for us here in the UK. It wasn't long ago that if you were a progressive in the UK, you would be pointing at the US and its economic orthodoxy as something to avoid. We wouldn't want to be doing much learning from the US, put it that way. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of people didn't see that massively changing on the election of Joe Biden, who's certainly more on the moderate side of the Democratic Party. But over the last few months, something quite exciting is happening in the US. Suddenly, progressives are around the world are looking to the Biden administration for some inspiration. Some commentators have even suggested that the so-called Bidenomics, for want of a better word, is a decisive turning point away from some of the neoliberal era of the past 3 decades or more. And he's kind of hailed the kind of that trickle down economics has never worked. And I suppose most relevant for us tonight, that direct cash payments have been central to Biden's plans. Some saying cash is now king. And in March, President Biden passed a whopping $1.9 trillion fiscal stimulus package through Congress in response to the pandemic. And within the package was another stimulus check, this time $1,400 to almost all Americans, and which was a third of such payments that Americans have received throughout the pandemic. So whilst it's not a universal basic income, we're not trying to claim that tonight, but it certainly legitimized the role that direct cash can play. And some have said, you know, it takes us a step closer to something like a basic income. But perhaps even more significant have been the reforms that he's introduced around the child tax credit, which is now a payment of $300 per month to every child under the age of 6 and $250 per month between the ages of 6 and 18. Now, crucially, the payments have gone from being yearly to monthly, and they've scrapped the child limit and have stripped out a lot of the work and all of the work requirements. So this is effectively a basic income for children. And at the moment, it's only scheduled to last a year, but that's set to cut child poverty by 50% in 1 year. Now, there are increasing calls now to make both of those measures permanent or monthly. And the debate around the role of direct cash payments and with it basic income is growing day by day in the US, which is really exciting. We've not even mentioned the scores of US cities that are now piloting guaranteed income programs, and that's not going to be the theme of tonight, but we might touch on it, particularly with the governor of California putting a lot of dollars into testing it further and doing his own version of the stimulus checks in California as well. Obviously, as I said, we're not trying to claim that this is a pure universal basic income. Before people say in the chat, we know that, but tonight is the question, are we moving closer in that direction? And I suppose, what does this all mean for us in the UK? We have a Labour Party who are now looking for inspiration to the Biden campaign about what kind of economic packages work and what's popular with the US public. And so we're going to get into that a little bit. And obviously, if I've got anything wrong in that introduction, then we've got some fantastic panelists who can fill in the gaps or correct me. And two of those joining us from the US, we've got Natalie Foster from the Economic Security Project and Professor Alma Zaliki from NYU in Shanghai to give us the American perspective on what's happening there and what it means for basic income. And then we've also got Financial Times journalist Martin Sambu to help us think through what impact this has on the UK and Europe. So we're going to get to our brilliant panel. Each of Natalie, Almaz and Martin are going to have about 5 to 7 minutes each to share some reflections. And then we'll get into, as Cleo said, a Q&A after that. So I'd first like to welcome Natalie. Natalie is the co-chair and co-founder of the Economic Security Project, which is a network to support the exploration and experimentation of a guaranteed income in the US. The Economic Security Project is fairly central, I think it's widely known, to the basic income story in the US in recent years. It's supported much of the best work that's being done, including the Stockton and Jackson demonstrations and pilots. Natalie has a background in organizing, having previously served as digital director on Obama's Organizing for America and the Democratic National Committee. And Natalie built some of the first digital department at the Sierra Club and also worked at Move On. So quite an established organizing background, which I really relate to because I'm a organizing background myself. And most recently, she's written a lot on the first few months of the Biden administration. And I'm really glad to have us with us here this evening, although obviously it's morning with you, Natalie, over there in California. A big welcome, and over to you. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. And it's just a pleasure to get to speak with you all. And I couldn't agree more with your introduction. You know, when we launched Economic Security Project, it was right around the time that the Swiss ballot referendum was happening. And European advocates came to kind of a crew that was growing in the US, and they were like, you guys need this more than we do. Why are we the ones running the ballot measure, pushing this conversation forward, when this is something that the US could really benefit from? And many of us in the US said, all right, you're right. And so it's felt like we've been playing catch up for a long time. And I'm just really, one of the silver linings of how hard this last year has been is that people are waking up to what it is we've all been talking about, that cash with no strings attached can change people's lives, right? It gives people the agency over their own lives, the ability to make their decisions and to participate more fully in society. The results coming out of Stockton, which you mentioned earlier, was, our first big demonstration we supported with Mayor Tubbs, who I think has been with you all, and you've gotten to spend some time with his genius. A young mayor in California who decided to demonstrate the idea of a guaranteed income. And the findings were non-obvious. The first year, which was prior to the pandemic, we found that the people had less stress, people went off medication. That part I expected, but the finding full-time work part was really interesting. So, the people who participated in the demonstration, who got $500 a month with no strings attached, found full-time work at double the rate people who didn't. And I think that is really instructive for where we are right now in the debate right now in the United States, which is around, do we have a labor shortage, or, are we just paying people not enough? Or in fact, do our systems punitively set up to allow people to make, their own decisions? So I really agree. None of us would have expected that candidate Joe Biden would be leading in the way he is. And I think there's a couple reasons for it. One, Joe Biden's a politician, and he is watching where the winds are blowing. And social movements in the United States have done incredible work over the last year with the racial uprisings last summer and the movement for Black Lives moment, with a lot of the work done around economic precarity in the United States and how deeply the economy was broken prior to the pandemic, and how that is more true for communities of color who have been shoved into low-wage jobs disproportionately over decades. There's been a lot of work done that politicians are actually taking notice of. So one, it's that Joe Biden actually remembers a time before neoliberalism where government had a role in shaping the markets. Labor was the trade union movement was a much more powerful force. And so I think precisely because he has been around for so long, he's in a position to lead in a way that many of us have wanted for a long time. So he's both reading the room, he's reading the politics that have shifted. And, I think that he himself is ready for this. So we're also excited about this year, and there's a lot of work to do. Right now, it's all talk, and the politics in the United States are very volatile. So I think we have this year to lock in some gains. Next year will be all about the midterms, and come the midterms of next year, we could lose the House or the Senate, which would mean nothing gets done. And then we have 2024, and who knows what could happen then. There's a lot of redistricting and really, really concerning anti-democracy work that's happening at the state level. So there's a lot to worry about. But this year, we have a shot at changing 50 years of racist, punitive policymaking around our social safety net, and really making things like the child tax credit permanent, which would be a much more from what I understand, even slightly more generous child allowance than many European countries have if it were enacted. It's about $250 roughly per kid paid out per month to around 82% of American parents who would receive the cash with no strings attached, able to spend the money on raising their children and their families' finances how they see fit. So very exciting. There's also a movement to advocate for more stimulus checks. As you pointed out in the overview, there's been 3 stimulus checks. It's around $850 billion that has gone out over the past year. That's been a 20% income boost for the lowest income earning households in the United States. It's averaged about $5,500 per household. So that's roughly over the course of a year. And $250 billion went to communities of color in the United States, which I think is very important given our long history in the US and the need for reparative work. So we put out a report on the year of stimulus checks, which I will put in chat. And I think these are the 2 things, sort of the fights to be had right now. Stimulus checks that come monthly and are tied to what's called automatic stabilizers, which means they're tied to conditions, economic conditions in the United States, and they would just turn on and off automatically if, let's say, unemployment got to a certain level. That is going to be a much harder hill to climb, though there is support for it both in the House and the Senate. A number of lawmakers have signed on to letters and are supporting legislation that would do regular stimulus checks tied to economic conditions. And then there's the making the child tax credit permanent fight, which is very live and very possible. It's a big priority for the Biden administration. It's a big priority for senators like Cory Booker, Michael Bennet out of Colorado, for members of the House like Barbara Lee, my representative in California, and Rosa DeLauro. And so there's reason to be optimistic, but we have to pass it. And that is in the next 4 to 6 months. So that's where I think the rubber meets the road. If this is just a moment where things are shifting, or if we can really codify this and change the system to take a baby step toward a guaranteed income in the United States.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Baby steps are definitely welcome. I've got lots of questions, and I'm sure some others on the call do as well. I know there's Lynn and Jane have been putting in a little bit of questions in there. We are going to come to questions in the Q&A, so do keep putting your questions in there. If you've got one for Natalie or any of the other panelists, do put them in the chat, and as I said, they'll be fielded later about sort of 6:40ish roughly. But now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Professor Almaz Zaliki. Almaz is a political scientist with a focus on political theory and public policy. She's a professor of practice in political science at NYU Shanghai, where she's joining us from New York today, where she's based. I first met her at the Basic Income Earth Network Congress in India, and that's because she's a crucial figure in the global basic income academic research field, particularly playing a leadership role in many of the global conferences that have taken place, particularly in the North American Basic Income Guarantee Congress, NABIG. And she's probably written some of the best stuff out there around basic income on racial and gender justice. And so do check out her work. We can maybe put some links in there. I'm always interested to hear her critical and thoughtful analysis of the movement in particular. So over to you, Almaz, and welcome.
Well, Michael, thank you for that very generous introduction. I am delighted to be here and really look forward to engaging in some of the discussion later on once we get to the Q&A. So let me just start by saying that I would agree with everything Natalie said and with what Michael said in terms of the overview over what the basic outlines are of the Biden stimulus payments and the child tax credits and how wonderful they are. I wanted to kind of take a little bit of a step back and see what this means in terms of the approach to economic security in the United States in a more general sense. So one thing to remember, and many of the audience may know this already, the stimulus payments actually began in the previous administration. And there's something that we've done in past economic crises, these one-time payments, often in presidential election years, to send out, just a blast of economic stimulus to all voters. So that's something that's kind of been in our toolbox for some time. So it wasn't surprising that that came out of the toolbox last year when the pandemic, first hit us in a really devastating way in the spring. The other thing that the previous administration did was to add a supplement to weekly unemployment benefits. So unemployment insurance covers employees in the formal sector who pay taxes toward this, and then when they're unemployed, they get a benefit that is, roughly speaking, about 45% of their earnings when they're unemployed. Traditionally, this is limited to a certain period of time, and the expectation is that people are looking for work, actively looking for work during that time. So those expectations were kind of suspended because there was no work to be had. We were trying to get people to stay home. But the $600 weekly supplement was actually so generous in our economy that it was, together with the unemployment benefits, it was more than many of our low-wage workers were earning in work. At the same time, we did have people who were still working, our frontline essential workers, who got no supplement because that $600 supplement was only for people who were receiving unemployment benefits. They did get the stimulus payment, however, as well. So we have our election, we have a new administration. Even right before the new administration took office, there was a second smaller stimulus payment in December, $600. And then President Biden, in the first weeks of his administration, did pass another bill with another stimulus. So this other stimulus went out. We're now having the conversation around those unemployment benefits. There is some anecdotal sense that people are having that workers are not eager to go back into the workplace, particularly in certain sectors, and restaurants and bars are one of the sectors where employers at least are reporting that they're having a hard time recruiting people. And so the sense is that maybe we've given people too much economic security, too much money for nothing, or too much of a supplement to their unemployment benefits, and they're not working. Now, let me just say outright that the evidence on that on a macro level is just not there. People are coming back into the workplace. In certain localized sectors, yes, it may be the case that the economic security that people have gotten from these other benefits is making them rethink particular jobs or jobs at particular levels of pay. That's perfectly possible. But the $600 weekly unemployment supplement was, in my opinion, kind of a missed opportunity. Again, this is the previous administration, not Biden, which I'll get back to in a moment, because that money could have just gone out in weekly supplement to everyone. Right. And so it would have supplemented the earnings of the income of the unemployed. It would have supplemented the income of people who are outside of the labor force for whatever reason. And it would also have supplemented the income of our frontline workers, delivery people, food service people, not to mention, of course, nurses and doctors and so on, but grocery store workers, et cetera. Okay, moving into the Biden administration, what I think is significant about his approach is that he's building on what was started in the previous administration, but transforming it in an important way, right? So we're used to these kind of emergency measures in the US once the economy starts at a macro level. Once the economy starts rebounding, then we get rid of those benefits. What he's saying is, this is still going on. We still need to send out stimulus money. And with the change to the child tax credit, we had an existing child tax credit, but it's a tax credit, which means that it's only really valuable to people who have a high level of tax that they owe, because then the credit reduces the amount of tax that they have to pay. But our lowest income workers don't actually owe federal income tax, and so they got no benefit from the child tax credit in the past. Now, because it's refundable, that's really the change that the Biden administration has implemented, in addition to making it a little bit more generous, but that it's refundable. So it goes to our lower income families as well. What I see this as is a shift from this kind of emergency crisis response to more of a, addressing structural systemic issues in our economy approach, right? We still need the stimulus as we're coming out of this economy, and we need to support families with children. And the second part of the Bidenomics, if we want to call it that, is not only these stimulus payments or the payments that came out of the first stimulus bill, but also the infrastructure spending that he is planning, right? So part of that is a traditional, let's say, hard infrastructure bill to fund repairs of bridges, roads, tunnels, et cetera, the kinds of things that we need to do and that will bring back jobs for those kinds of workers. The second part of his infrastructure plan, we might call soft infrastructure, right? And that's the infrastructure of care, right? Of the kinds of things that allow people with dependents, people with children, people with elders, people with other sick family members to have the opportunity both to do the care that they want to do, provide the care that they need to do, and also have the opportunity to be in the labor force. So I see this shift from this kind of crisis economics to an investment economics. And that I think is really important because in the US, as I think you all know, we have an aversion to giving people money unless we can target that money to the people that we think are deserving, right? And typically that's people who have jobs or who had jobs and had jobs in particular kinds of industries or firms, and not general economic support. We're very much afraid of free riding, right? That somebody might take that income support and then not contribute in some way. So I think he's shifting that conversation. He's kind of bypassing it a little bit by focusing on the investment, by focusing on infrastructure, care as infrastructure, which is so important. So that I think is a great shift. What I would say we need to do to build on it is to think about how we keep that momentum going, not only in the kind of legislative way that Natalie spoke to. We have a short window when Biden still has a majority of the House of Representatives and an even split in the Senate to get things done. I think it's very wise that he has gone for this 1 year implementation of the child tax credit, refundable child tax credit, because it'll be harder, I think, for legislators to take that away next year in the run up to the midterm elections. So I think strategically that's very smart, right? It's not a pilot, it's an implementation. And he's kind of daring Republicans now to take it away once it's already been implemented and people have started getting those checks in their bank accounts. So definitely we want to build on that. I think one of the things that we need to build on is we need to create the infrastructure for getting these direct payments out. So one of the things that we found during the pandemic is that it's actually not that easy to get money to even Americans. I mean, those of us in the basic income world, we know this is an issue in developing countries where not everybody is attached to a bank, but it turns out that's the case in the United States as well. So we need to think about how are we actually getting this money out to people. And typically we get this kind of stimulus money out to Americans through the tax system, through the Internal Revenue Service, rather than in a different way. And the reason that's important is because, again, not all of our low-income workers pay taxes. Those who don't have earned incomes often don't pay taxes, don't have to file returns. So they're not in that system. So in addition to kind of the legislative push that Natalie has been suggesting, I think we also want to think about what's the infrastructure that we need to make sure that we can implement this in the future. So one would be, and we don't have to get into the weeds here, but I would shift the payments to the Social Security Administration, which is our pension system for elders that's very efficient and very effective, away from the tax system, from the IRS. We need to expand access to low-cost banking for those who are currently unbanked. Then there are a couple, those are kind of, I don't think anyone would disagree with those. Those are kind of, they're not necessarily easy to do, but they're not that controversial. The more controversial things are that we also should move to individualized taxation and individualized benefits of all sorts. So in our current system, many of our income-based benefits go to households. They're calculated on a household basis, right? And so this makes sense. Households have economies of scale, makes sense to send the money to households. But this is where we start to get into some of the difficulties in the current welfare system that make cash a better alternative, right? Because we have the issue of either we're two-parent families or we're lone parent families. How do we account for that double burden of work and care in lone parent families? So, do we give more to lone parents? That seems to be de-incentivizing being married. Do we give more to married couples? Then what do you do about the group that's in the largest group in poverty? So we want to individualize benefits, and we also want to individualize taxation. So we have that basis for determining whether you're in the 80% that gets these benefits or not. I also think that we need to start talking about extending wealth taxation in the United States from the middle class to the wealthy. Currently, we have wealth taxation on the middle class in the forms of property taxes on homes, which is where the middle class has their wealth, but we don't tax financial wealth. So we haven't really talked about how we're paying for all the stimulus. I think that should be part of the conversation, and we should be thinking about wealth taxation for that purpose. So why don't I stop there and see what the questions are in the Q&A.
I reckon there's already a couple of questions in there, but there will definitely be more later. I've definitely got a few there. I've been scribbling some notes and maybe trying to translate some of the stuff into a British context as well. Lots of similarities there about some of the challenges that we face. Yeah, do keep putting your questions in there in the chat to both Almaz, Natalie, and our next panelist, who is a journalist and author, Martin Sambu. Martin is the Financial Times European economics commentator. He has written about the US stimulus package, and just today he had an article on the FT about Bidenomics and what it is and what it isn't. Before joining the FT, he worked in academia and policy consulting. He taught and carried out research at Harvard and Columbia and the Wharton School, and has advised governments and NGOs on natural resources and economic development. He's also the author of 3 books, one of which is behind him on his screen, The Economics of Belonging, his most recent book, which discusses basic income. And Martin often comments on basic income, one of the few journalists that really openly talks about it in a really thoughtful and interesting way, which I'm sure he will do so this evening. His role tonight is to kind of reflect on a little bit of what we've heard from Natalie and Almaz, and I suppose reflect on that from a UK and European perspective. So Martin, over to you.
Thank you so much. I've got a couple of windows up here. Did I manage to unmute myself? You can hear me. Very
Yes.
good. Thanks very much. Too much of an introduction. I will say a little bit. I am very much a supporter of basic income. I won't say so much about that unless we get back to it in discussion, maybe a bit at the end. What I'd like to do is basically in 2 parts, comment a bit on how everything that's going on in the US may inspire or create learning in Europe. And then something about how this whole discussion looks from a European perspective, because there are things underway or shifting in the way people think about it here as well. I mean, with all of this is sort of with the caveat that anything in the direction of making basic income more likely is very incremental and slow. So don't get too excited about what I say, but I want to talk about kind of the direction of travel, that it's very, very slow travel. What the US does always matters. It matters because it affects Europe, but it matters in terms of ideas. And we've seen this in the 80s, we've seen it earlier. When something becomes a new received view of how the economy works in the US, it tends to open a room for thinking the same in European politics and for the direction of policy in European politics. And I think we see that now. It's very clear to everyone that Biden is running a huge experiment. Everyone will be watching everyone who decides anything about economic policy in Europe is watching and will see if it works. It will not be primarily on the social sort of restoring whatever welfare state the US ever had. It'll be more about the macro picture, I think, that European politicians will be looking at. But some of the more micro things as well. And so in terms of the other speakers, and you also, Mike, have gone through the details of what's happening in the US, so I don't have to do that. I'll just make kind of 3 points about where I think there are very interesting possible learning effects. So one is on the stimulus checks, the direct payments. The fact that the US does them, it's unusual, right? Most countries don't do this. And so when the US does them, it is noticed, and it was much more noticed this time than the ones in the previous decade or 2 decades ago, because we're all in this crisis now and are paying attention. But I think what it did was to demonstrate the practical problem of a more targeted, means-tested welfare state, of actually reaching the people in need. And that's something that was experienced in Europe as well. It's not, even with the sophisticated welfare states in Europe, it's not always obvious to reach all the ones you need to reach in a really big crisis like this one. I think it matters that there's been bipartisan interest in direct payments. It's something that works for both parties in the US. I mean, I think it was Almaz who mentioned that, of course, the first direct payment came under the Trump administration. And there's a very interesting, I think, aspect in that it will address the whole targeting debate. Part of the criticism against the Biden administration, including the friendly fire from people like Larry Summers, is that it's ill-targeted. These direct payments go to people who don't need them, all the way up to, what is it, 70,000 annual income. But this is sort of a test of the proposition that it's actually better to give it to everyone, or almost everyone, than to try to target. You will reach the people you need to reach better. You will effectively target better if you give it to everyone. I mean, that's a very important principle in the basic income conversation. What's happening in the US is a very important test of that. If it's seen as having been largely wasted on people who didn't need it, that will have different political consequences than if it's seen as being, well, actually, this was a good way of doing it. On the child tax credits, I think they are important too, but maybe not for the reasons we might think. I think somebody pointed out in the chat that what Biden has introduced is essentially what all of Europe has, i.e., a child benefit. But what I think is interesting is that in the US context, it is discussed as part of the basic income conversation. And I think that matters because in Europe, we tend to forget that we already have basic income. We have a quasi-universal basic income, a basic income for all children, essentially, or their parents or carers. So, whenever the discussion, the accusations of utopianism or turn to utopianism, it's always useful to remember we do have it. And it's one of the most secure bits of the European welfare state. So I think it's useful for the conversation that this is framed a bit in that way in the US. It may now become permanent because in the third pillar of these huge proposals from the Biden administration, the American Families Plan, part of it is to make it permanent, not just 1 year. So we'll see if that passes. But it's politically clever, as Almaz pointed out. But I think, and maybe here I differ a bit with what's been said before, I think it's quite important that it takes the form of a refundable tax credit. It's a bit of a ruse, right? Instead of giving people cash, you give them a tax credit. Everyone loves tax credit. And you just tweak it by making it refundable rather than non-refundable. Sounds super geeky and technical, but it means that that's the way you get it to the poorest people. Popular education, if you like, around these sorts of mechanisms. I think that if we ever do get a fully fledged UBI in any country, it may well take the form of a general refundable tax credit. That's how you can do it, right? Sort of negative income tax model. But you can, and politically it just sounds very different. So I think it's important that that's what the US is doing, and let's see if it can work and we can learn from it. Final learning point, is on the automatic stabilizers that I believe Natalie mentioned, unless it was Almaz, I'm sorry. Very geeky thing, but also very important because everyone who advises economic policymakers is interested in this. Automatic stabilizers is basically the things that kick in by themselves when you're in a downturn. And there's very strong consensus, I would say, in the economics community that automatic stabilizers are a good thing. They can be more forceful. They are more forceful in Europe than they are in the US, and that's what helps Europe. The reason why I think this is important is because direct payments are a pretty good candidate for exactly how you want to design those automatic stabilizers. So something like a system that pays out a direct payment whenever GDP growth is negative, for example, right? You can see how it's kind of it's easier to defend that sort of thing as an insurance mechanism for the economy. But you can also talk about it when times are good. It feels less threatening, I think, to opponents of this sort of system. So those are, I think, 3 important learning points. I'm spending far too long, so I'll be very quick about some of the European dynamics. Again, 3 points about things that are changing in Europe. One was the pandemic itself. Even in Europe, there was a realization that actually it's not so easy to reach people. There was a discussion of basic or direct payments or basic income in Norway, of all places. Norway has one of the most sophisticated welfare states. Even there were problems in the furlough schemes for unemployed people or people not allowed to work because of pandemic rules. It wasn't always obvious to get them all their money as soon as they should, basically because of work overload at the Social Security administrations. So this conversation even came up there. So this practical challenge of helping the ones you want to help is important and has been raised, I think, in the general policy-making consciousness, also in Europe. The second thing happening in Europe is that there's an increasing realization that the European welfare states themselves aren't working very well anymore. We heard about the precariat in the US. Well, there's a precariat in Europe too. And interestingly, there's a precariat kind of regardless of what labor market model you have. There's a precariat in the very unregulated, flexible UK labor market. And there's a precariat in the very regulated French or Spanish labor markets. So this is, it's now very much understood that the old model doesn't work anymore. It doesn't deliver what it's supposed to. I was on my very first cross-border trip in 15 months, 2 weeks ago, to the EU Social Summit, a summit of all the EU leaders on the social agenda. And there is very clearly a change in mentality happening, which again may not go very far. But there is an agenda on the table that's being considered seriously by the top leaders. The Commission has already proposed an adequate minimum wage directive, and it plans to issue a recommendation on guaranteed minimum incomes. That's not the same as basic income. Everyone in this meeting know the difference. But it means that the conversation is sort of moving in a favorable direction for those who like basic income. Last point, the Green Deal. The Green Deal has a social aspect problem. Think of it as the yellow vest problem, the Gilets jaunes revolt in France. It was triggered, sort of straw that broke the camel's back, by a rise in fuel prices. Since then, everyone in Europe, and I think in the US increasingly, are aware that the carbon transition has to be done in a socially just way. In that context, there's increasing interest in this idea of carbon cap and dividend, or carbon tax and dividend, or carbon fee and dividend, which even has adherents in the Republican Party in the US. So there's a new opening in the green agenda for something that looks quite a lot like that is a basic income, essentially. Tax carbon, or auction permits or whatever, and use that money to redistribute it so that the worse off are not made any worse off by the carbon transition. Economists advising the French government, the German government have looked at this, have modeled it. It's a real thing in the geeky economist community. And And I trust it will at some point kind of break into the broader policymaking conversation. So those are the things I wanted to cover. There is a change in thinking, and I think to the extent that we see a change in thinking on both sides of the Atlantic towards the idea that social policy and social security is not just something that is a matter of justice, something that's nice to have, but something that helps the economy function, something that's good for productivity. That's a place basic income advocates should like to be. In my own book, I advocate basic income basically on that ground, that having a basic income would allow people to leave bad jobs in order to look for better ones. And that's something that's good for productivity for the whole economy. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Martin, to get both perspectives there from both sides of the Atlantic. We're going to dig into some of the things that Martin discussed there shortly. Before going into the Q&A, I just wondered if any of the panelists had a reflection or a question to one of the other panelists, something that you heard or found interesting. Nasi, I saw you put something in the chat there about inflation. I don't know if it's that, but do you want to come in and pose something to both Almaz and Martin?
Yeah, I mean, Martin said that there will be a real test to the idea of direct cash transfers to like 80 to 90% of the country. And I think one of the places we'll see that manifest is in the growing rumblings around inflation in the US. So I was just wondering if I'd love both of your thoughts on that, how you're thinking about it. Is it just a momentary price hike, or are we actually in a problem? And even if we aren't, the forces that don't like this idea will gather behind that is one of my concerns.
Alma, do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I think that in general, I agree with Natalie that the inflation boogeyman is often brought out when we talk about basic income. But I'm not an economist, but from my limited understanding of macroeconomics, inflation happens when the government prints too much money and goes beyond the productive capacity of the country. So, I'm actually in favor of increasing taxes in order to pay for what we're spending. I don't think that we should put off the cost of the investments that we're making in the current generation to future generations, for example. So I'm not a deficit hawk. I don't think we have to always have a balanced budget or have no debt. I think the United States is very fortunate to be in the position it is in the world economy to be allowed to have as much debt as it does. But I actually think that a basic income and these stimulus payments should be redistributive of the money that's already out there. So that's the way I would address in inflationary concerns in general. I don't really know enough about the particular situation we're in right now, although I imagine we've had a little bit of price deflation from the pandemic, and so a little bit of inflation would not be unexpected.
Thanks, Almas. Martin?
I can just build on that. I mean, that last point is very much right. We've had below target inflation for not just in the pandemic, but for years before that, especially in Europe, not a little bit in the US. Mm-hmm. So there's some slack to, some lost ground to make up for. I don't think we're going to have an inflation problem, actually, but it's a real debate, and you can have reasonable arguments on both sides. I think that probably still a lot of people unemployed or underemployed, and the various bottlenecks we see as the dust settles and the economy adjusts, you'll probably get rid of the price pressures we see right now. So I don't actually think there'll be a problem at all. But I think the bogeyman terminology is correct. It doesn't really matter whether it happens or whether it's a real problem, or if it happens, whether it has anything to do with basic income. It will be used to attack whatever those people don't like. But just to kind of use what Almaz said and throw the ball back at both of you, Natalie and Almaz, I think it's really important to think of basic income in the context of the tax system, partly precisely to make that point that, look, it's not just about spending a lot more here. It's about the context of how we redistribute. Of course, in the long term, as a permanent policy, it has to be financed regularly. But one of you, and I can't remember who, was suggesting for sort of practical logistical reasons, it might make sense to move direct payments from the tax system to the Social Security system. I actually think for political economy reasons, you want to have it in the tax system. partly, I think, actually practically that's how it will be implemented if it ever happens. And I think in time, if everyone knows that they can get something back on net from the tax system, they'll make sure to register for taxes. But it allows you to keep the discussion where I think it belongs, which is what is a redistributive structure of our tax system. And when you think about it, the sensible, practical basic income proposals that have come out, I'm thinking, for example, of the proposal made by Compass in the UK, Stuart Lansley and Howard Reid, was it? But many other proposals too, they basically start with saying, let's take the tax-free allowances in the income tax rules and make them into refundable tax credits instead. A little bit like what we said about the US child credit. That is something you can much more easily do if you keep this squarely within the tax system. So this is maybe more a challenge, partly question. But I think the political economy of this, and even the logistics, if you do the work, favor keeping it as part of a tax system and a part of a tax discussion.
So I'm keen to get Almaz and Natalie's thoughts on this, because I suspect there might be a slightly different take. So Almaz, you were trying to get in. What's your take on this?
Well, I leave it to you to let me know whether you think your audience is interested in the nerdy details of whether this should be implemented through the Social Security system in the United States or the IRS. I'm happy to go into that. I'm not sure that that's the hill I want to die on, at least in this particular session here. I think there are good reasons, but again, if it ends up being through the tax system, that would be okay with me. The question I wanted to ask, if I can just throw it out there, and then Michael, I'll leave it to you to decide whether we pursue that or pursue the implementation question, is it seemed to me that both Martin and Natalie were approaching this moment in time as a moment for a kind of pragmatic and reformist approach to improving our social safety net in the United States. And I see this as more of a once in a generation opportunity for some really more significant realignments of economic and political power. I will say that, I'm certainly happy to see the reformist approach succeed. My concern is that when we've had that tension in the past in the United States, when we've gone in the reformist direction, it's had really serious implications for particular populations. So, for example, many people may not know, but in the United States in the 1930s, when Social Security, our pension system for seniors, was created, there was actually a much more radical alternative out there that was being pushed by an activist group that was very generous payments for all men and women over the age of 60 with no reference to work requirements. So, okay, that was not likely to be implemented. What we got instead was Social Security, which has expanded over time and become much more inclusive and much more generous. It was very small and not very generous at first. But one of the things that happened at the beginning was that agricultural and domestic workers were excluded from Social Security coverage, which meant that most African Americans were excluded. Many women were excluded. Many workers in the South were excluded. Right. So, I don't want to go back into that history and debate whether something bigger could have happened then, but those compromises have generational compounding effects, right? The differences we see in African American wealth, for example, compared to white wealth now, can be partially traced back to their exclusion from their grandparents' exclusion from Social Security in the 1930s. So I'd like to think that we have the opportunity because of this pandemic, and we should never let a crisis go to waste. Also the awful, crisis of violence against African Americans that has stimulated such a profound social movement in the United States. This seems like an opportunity to go big and to think big rather than to take the more pragmatic approach. So I'd be interested in your opinions on that.
I'm going to take Natalie's opinions on that before we go to the Q&A. Sorry, Martin, but I think it's kind of linked to the the question of how it happens as well too. But Natalie, over to you.
I just think you're summing up this spirit of the moment. Is it radical, or is it, sort of incremental, and it's yes. It's yes and is really where I think we are, and that is really what Joe Biden embodies, which is a comforting, folksy demeanor. I'm just selling you a tax credit, folks. That's what we're here doing. But the policy that his administration is putting forward is a significant shift away from neoliberalism. We are talking about industrial policy to combat climate change in America for the first time in my career as a social change advocate. We are talking about the shift from infrastructure being just guys in hard hats to understanding its caregiving, as Almaz laid out so beautifully, that it is women, largely women of color, who care for kids that make work happen in the United States. And that's infrastructure that we need to invest in with the same gusto that we invest in bridges and roads. And that narrative is shifting under our feet in a really incredible way. And we're talking about a child allowance paid out with no strings attached, which is something we have not done in the United States since probably Social Security that you're talking about, in the 30s. So it's a really powerful moment where the policies are profound, but the delivery is not, and it's hard to sort of know which way to go. But it all comes down to the Senate and the House. Truthfully, can you get the set of very conservative Democrats in the Senate to say yes? And if so, we can go. And if you can't, that's where it will have to be, so I think that's where the fight is, where I see so much activist energy in the United States, is really focusing on a set of folks who are going to be needed to get something through the Senate to get the Biden agenda passed.
Thanks, Natalie. I'm going to kind of jump off the back of those comments and bring in some of the questions that we've had from our audience on the chat. And if you've got there's already some comments in there, keep questions coming. We're going to try and get to as many as possible. I suppose what you're describing there, both Natalie and Almaz, and you've touched on it too, Martin, is the sense that the Overton window is shifting around potential of UBI. This is one of the questions that Michael Wells had. And but it's also something that Tim Stanyon was asking, essentially, like, how long does this Overton window stay open for? Like, how do we keep any focus on these topics in the minds and actions of politicians beyond the COVID crisis? Because we know what kind of Almaz, if we take a certain route, and some of us will have short memories about what this experience was. So yeah, to all of you, what were your comments on, like, how do we keep is the Overton window open? I think we've kind of suggested that it is, but how long do you think it will stay open, both in the US and in Europe? So first of all, Almaz, if you can.
Well, I think Natalie's exactly right. In the United States, it ends in November of 2022, or it continues, depending on what happens in the election. So I think what's really important is all the work that Biden and Harris and others in the administration are doing to go directly to individuals in the states where they might not necessarily have the support of the representatives and the senators, to sell what they're doing directly to people. I think as much money as we can get out to individuals now, and they see that those checks coming from the government making a difference in their lives, will hopefully mean that we keep the window a little bit open a little bit longer. In fact, actually improve our margins in the House and Senate going forward, so that we can continue to do this work. I do think that there has been a shift. I think the racial justice movement in the United States has made that shift. Many of us have been talking about reparations for decades. We actually see organizations now implementing reparations. We see it in cities, we see it in nonprofits. So that is happening. So that's a conversation that's already, I think, shifted. Now we're not talking about should we have reparations, but really kind of what kind, or how do we do them. I think that the whole conversation about women and care and what makes it possible for women to participate in the labor market, I think that has shifted permanently. I hope that conversation has shifted permanently. So I don't know. I can't answer the question of how long it stays open, but I think it's open now and we should take advantage of it. Yeah.
What about in the UK and Europe, Martin? It's weird, isn't it, that in the UK, at least, I can only speak for it, feels as though there was this big sense of, wow, we could maybe get change. And I don't know, amongst lots of change advocates, it feels like some of that's become frustrated by the current government. But what's your take on that? Like, how long is it open, and how long will it be open for?
I think it is open. I think it's open everywhere because of the pandemic. I think it's open in the UK for more reasons, which is how the whole political system was thrown upside down by the referendum and Brexit and all of this, and where, whether you believe them or not, the current government, are trying to sell themselves as a very reformist, radically reformist government, leveling up, all of that. But how long I don't think it's going to stay open very long, unless it's exploited. And so, I'll sort of cheat here and answer the previous question too. I think we should go big. In that book, I advocated going big, not just in the US, in most countries, sort of big, fundamental, broad, radical reform, big in scope and big in scale, partly for political reasons, because I think that it's actually easier politically to push through big, fundamental, radical reform than incremental tweaks. Partly because if you throw a lot of your opponents, it's harder to resist, right? They have to pick their battles. Partly because if you then get things through, nothing succeeds like success. Political capital is a sort of weird thing. If you spend it and are seen to succeed, you get more of it, right? So I think Biden's doing exactly the right thing, doing something very big, and to the extent that it's seen as working, we might well be positively surprised in 2022, and it will open the window further or for longer. But that's why I think that the key thing here in how radical should one be, I think what you really want to aim for is permanence and irreversibility. So really prioritize reforms that, if you get them, they'll be pretty much impossible to overturn. That's just crucial. And I think the refundable child tax credit, if you get that into permanent law with the American Families Plan, that's very hard to reverse afterwards. If you manage to raise the minimum wage, that's very hard to reverse. Nobody wants to pass a law saying we're going to cut the minimum wage, unless you're Greece facing default and being told to do it, right? That's sort of the one case. And in the UK and in Europe, I think it's the same thing. I think there's, the need for big reform is lesser in Europe, but it's still dire. But the US is in a much worse place even than the worst performing European countries.
Natalie, what are your thoughts on this? And we've also, just to kind of throw another one at you, Natalie, while on this topic, Tim has also asked about, in this moment coming up to November and in this short window, is there a prospect of Republicans softening their views? I know you mentioned Mitt Romney there earlier on in the chat, and also like the political, it's popular, isn't it, Cash? The Georgia state runoff was wildly popular, and we have in the UK a Labour Party who's certainly certainly wouldn't be following the going big approach that Martin's talking about here, but in the US, Biden's gone down that route and has seen it's wildly popular. Do you want to kind of unpack a little bit of that for us?
Yeah, cash checks, direct checks are good policy and good politics. And that is the case we've been trying to make for a long time. And we saw it. The only reason the Democrats have the Senate in the United States is because Reverend Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff ran on stimulus checks to Georgians, which poll at 76% in the United States. They're very popular across every side of the aisle. And as they started talking about checks, they surged in the polls and eventually won. So, part of what they need to do is say, in fact, I delivered not only on this one stimulus check, but on these child checks that you will start getting in July. So the first checks with our new child allowance or the child tax credit start hitting bank accounts in July and will run through the end of the year unless we make it permanent. Then they'll continue on. And so, it's the psychology of taking something away from people is much harder than to give people something. So we're right at that moment where we need to, the IRS this week announced they will move the child checks starting July 15th. And that's when I think we'll start to see the politics even deepen into politics around permanency and making this a part of the social contract in America, that parents receive money with no strings attached, to raise their children. And from there, I hope we can continue to build out for more people. So yeah, I think it's now understood widely in the Democratic circles as good policy and good politics, which is a major change from the past year. And I don't know if that's true on the Republican side, in part because, as I put in chat, they are in a civil war as to who they are, what they are. They literally just, censured Liz Cheney for believing that Donald Trump, in fact, didn't win, the election was not stolen from him, and they're still fighting over whether or not the election was legit, whether or not the insurrectionists in January, should have been there. I mean, so they need to sort that out and decide who they want to be. Because when you did see Mitt Romney come out with I thought, a very good child tax credit proposal. I disagreed with him on how you'd pay for it, but the idea that there would be checks with no strings attached, paid out monthly to the majority of American parents, that's a big shift. Now, not a lot of Republicans, supported him when he came out with that plan. You saw Josh Hawley, who's very controversial, take to the floor with Bernie Sanders, advocating for checks last December. So there have been moments where they've sort of understood, but it's not sticking. And in part because I think they're playing a different game right now than really trying to figure out how to help the American people.
Almaz, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, that to me sounds like a great opportunity to try some other moves that they might not actually be, they might not be on their radar screen. They might not be, prepared to counter in a particular way. So, for example, I think the opportunity of having the first female vice president and the first female secretary of the Treasury would be an opportunity to say, let's look at the way the tax system treats women, right? So my husband and I are both wage earners, and on our tax return, he's the taxpayer and I'm the spouse. This is 2021. I'm a taxpayer too. I'm an earner too. And somehow I'm secondary in the tax system because I'm a woman. Let's do that, right? So I think that there are things that we could do to build on the general moments that actually also advance the goal of a universal basic income in the future, right? A universal basic income, not guaranteed income, not cash transfers that might have conditions, there might be limited, but a universal basic income. There are things that we could be doing now while the Republicans are distracted by their civil war. And I think individualizing the tax system could be part of it. I think, reforming the social safety net programs that we have that have either these benefit cliffs, right? So if you get a certain amount of income, you reach a certain income level, you lose your access to Medicaid, which is our health insurance program for poor and low income workers. Let's get rid of that. Let's raise it, right? Some of these things can be done on a state level. So at the state level, I think, wherever there is an income ceiling, or wherever there is a benefit cliff, or wherever there is a condition, we want to start taking those away. Right, that moves us in the direction of a seamless, basic income program where we can individualize tax benefits. We should do that as well. Where we can work on financial access for poor people. We should be doing that now. So build the infrastructure while they're not looking, and continue, at the level where they are looking to, to keep saying, like, you're getting a check, right? Let's remind you, you're getting a check because of this bill, because these are the people who voted for it. These are the people who are running for re-election next year who didn't vote for it. We should keep hounding that message. But I want us to take the long view of how, what would a basic income world look like? And what steps can we take now in this moment to prepare the ground for, hopefully having the power to implement this on a more permanent basis next year.
Thanks, Almaz. I mean, we're amazingly that we've gone through time so quickly. We've now just got 6 minutes left, and so I'll be handing back to Cleo shortly. So we've definitely not had enough time to get to everyone's questions. That's largely because how interesting the three of our panelists have been. Within the chat, there's been a little bit of a discussion about, I suppose, this moment that I think I'm taking from you as the panelists of, like, we are in this moment, Overton window. Do we go big? Do we go reformist? And, like, there's merits to both, and it's not either or, of course, but doing stuff through the back door as well as taking opportunities that present themselves politically. I want to ask all of you what advice you'd have learning from the American experience, and in Martin's, your case, the other European experience, of what advice you'd have to policymakers or progressive politicians here in the UK. Because as Ruth Lister on the chat has mentioned, there's a growing debate about whether should we be going down a minimum income guarantee approach or a universal basic income approach. They're obviously similar, but they do have important differences. There's also been some discussion in the chat about the role, the framing of this. It sounds as though kind of the stuff around deservedness and work, it's just kind of gone out the window temporarily in the US in conversation, but it's not really done so here. You've heard politicians often talking about those that need it most in terms of some of those support packages that have come in. So there's kind of some of the questions around infrastructure that Almaz, you raised around. We've had similar questions. We've had the furlough scheme, but it's left many millions of people still unable to access the support schemes. Just the inability to get cash into people's bank accounts is such a big problem here. So we've got some of the similar problems. I just wanted to go back through the panelists, what advice that you would have, given all of that and the experience of what's happening in the US, to progressive policymakers and politicians here. And I'm going to go backwards from how we started. So Natalie first.
I really don't think that the response to the pandemic was a given. Like when I think about and that the response to the pandemic would include direct cash. When I think about 2009, in the recession we were in, what we did was we expanded the earned income tax credit, which does have a deservedness built in, right? It is only income earners who receive that. That's how we responded to individual families. And we did, the big, the corporate, bailout essentially, and a whole lot of shoring up of American industries. It was important, but there wasn't direct cash to families in quite the same way. And so I think that part of the reason we saw stimulus checks is because the social movements had been working hard. You've seen a surge of a movement around a guaranteed income in the United States, around a universal basic income. We have people running for office on it for the first time in my lifetime. We have now 50 mayors, soon to be 58 mayors who've signed on to Mayors for a Guaranteed Income. These are elected officials who run cities, some of the biggest cities in the United States, including, Los Angeles. The mayor of LA has set aside $24 million in his budget for a pilot in LA. And that is just one of dozens happening across the country. So there's that. Plus there's, folks who are rallying in the streets. There was Andrew Yang's presidential run. So there's a number of things that have created the conditions for the politicians who frankly take our lead to advocate for this idea. And yeah, the words, I think this is important. The words shift as it moves into the mainstream. But I think our job is to hold the core values. And Almaz is naming a set of things that we need to hold on to, like individual recipients of money. The fact that there's no strings attached to the dollars, there's no inspectors coming into your home or any of the punitive aspects of the existing social safety net. So those are just some of the thoughts I have, really, is that invest in the social movement work as well as the inside game of the politicians, because both are needed.
Thanks, Natalie. And lots of people on the call are involved in that work to build the social movement for this, which is really exciting work. Almaz, what's your learning and advice that you'd give to us folks here in the UK?
Well, I would say, the risk of being a little bit of a skunk at the garden party, I would say invest in incremental changes, but that are permanent and that move us in the right direction. I think there's a lot of energy being put into pilots right now. And I think that's in many cases because there's a desire to have sort of good stories come out of the pilots that spread the word about what basic income can do. My concern there is that a lot of the good stories that come out of the pilots are about whether people work or not, who receive them. So I think that has the unfortunate effect of reinforcing the idea that basic income is something that we give to people who are deserving. So I would say that if we've got that energy to implement pilots, I would put that energy instead into saying, what's one thing about the way taxes or benefits, or other kinds of programs are run in my city or my town or my country? What's one thing, one small thing that I can do that would change that and shift in the direction of either individuality, unconditionality, or universality?
Thanks, Alma. I know some people on the call will be really interested in that, because that's a hot topic of debate within the basic income movement here in the UK, is to, do we go down the pilots track for all in there, or thinking about some of the other reforms to be made.
That's why I threw that in there.
Yeah, no, thank you. Enormously helpful. And finally, Martin, kind of what advice would you give to us folks here in the UK?
So two things. One, just narrow, because I was listening to Almaz and that last point about deservingness. We don't want to get hung up on deservingness, which is another reason, I think, to keep it inside the tax thinking rather than the social security thinking, where immediately you say, well, who are the needy, and among the needy, who are the deserving needy, and so on. So that's the narrow thing. The bigger thing, all of Europe, the social democratic parties have been in a funk since the global financial crisis, even before, and they're not really, it's very hard to get out of that funk. The Green parties in proportional representation systems are actually doing much better. In the UK, you're sort of stuck with a two-party system. I think what the Labour Party could do, really looking to the US, is to do better than they have done in taking this moment and standing up and saying, look, for a year, we've been letting the state, the government, do things that it never did before. And we all agreed it was necessary. Now, let's not try to talk about getting out of that to get back to normal, but to build on that and keep that in order to achieve all the other goals we want to achieve as a society. That sort of narrative, I don't really hear from the Labour Party. They tend to get sort of stuck in detailed policy proposals. But that sort of big story, which Biden tells so well, we've all been through hell together. Now let's use what we learned and use the tools we built to continue to build better. So everyone says building back better, but unfortunately the Conservatives are giving that narrative better than the Labour Party are. But that's what the challenge is, I think.
That's the challenge. You've also been challenged, Martin, to a smackdown with Almaz on the implementation of basic income. So perhaps that's a future event for us. But we have come to the end. I want to respect everybody's time this evening and this morning, where our guests in the US, I know you've got busy days ahead, I would imagine. So I want to thank everybody for the questions. We couldn't get to all of them, understandably, but it just shows the level of interest in this. A huge thank you to everyone for being here and submitting those questions, and those of you listening back online as well in the future. We have been recording this session, so those of you attending, you'll get an email with a link to see this and share it. As I mentioned at the beginning, tonight's event has been our first in our series of research network events. The next one of which will be on the 8th of July. We'll be collaborating with the New Economics Foundation to really dig into this question about basic income or guaranteed income, and how those two ideas relate and complement each other or not. Cleo, do you want to very briefly just put the link in the chat? You have done there. There's links there in terms of how you can download the toolkit to start your own conversation like the one that we've had this evening, and also get involved in the research network. Cleo, do you want to quickly make a plea for that?
Yes, do it. Download the toolkit, talk about basic income, and if you're researching basic income, get in touch with us so we can connect you up with other wonderful people doing the same thing. I mean, listen to all your wonderful insights that we've had the pleasure of doing this evening.
Absolutely. That particularly those researchers on the call, and if you know any others, we're keen to kind of connect it up and make this kind of vibrant and diverse basic income research field grow and grow internationally, and Almaz has obviously been a key part of that for a long time now. So others want to get involved. A huge thanks to everyone again. We'll be in touch soon. It leaves me to say a huge particular thanks to Almaz, Natalie, and Martin. I hope to speak to you all soon in some form. Hugely grateful, hugely insightful as always. Have a lovely rest of your evening, everyone, and good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.